Welcome to RSG Insider, where we discuss issues facing local jurisdictions. I'm Tara Matthews, a principal at RSG, and I'm joined today by Alex Lawrence to discuss the Surplus Land Act. Hello, nice to see you. Maybe you can start off by just sharing a little bit about your background and your experience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tara. So I'm a senior associate. I've been with RSG for about 6 years now. I've managed over 24 Surplus Land Act transactions, and I've worked to help influence legislation on this topic to help better serve our clients.
All right, well, let's dig into this topic. Let's start with, what is the Surplus Lands Act?
Yeah, so essentially the Surplus Land Act is a California law. It requires that public agencies offer their surplus land, which is essentially land that they no longer need, to affordable housing developers and certain public entities before selling or leasing it to anyone else on the open market.
And is this a new requirement or has this been around for a while?
So actually, despite all the attention it's been getting recently, it's actually not a new law. It was originally enacted in the 1960s, but it gained a lot of attention in 2019 when AB 1486 put enforcement measures into place for any non-compliance. And then again in 2023 when AB 480 and SB 747 further amended the law.
So it sounds like it's an existing law that's had a lot of legislative amendments recently. So what does this mean for local jurisdictions or agencies, and how does it affect them?
So essentially, agencies now have to follow a very specific process if they want to sell their land. If the land is considered surplus, they have to declare it as such and then follow very specific procedures and selection criteria that's outlined in the law. If the transaction will qualify for an exemption, they don't have to follow that surplus process I just mentioned, but they do have to declare it exempt, and then they have to follow through with the transaction under the requirements of that exemption.
This sounds like a very detailed process. So with that in mind, how should a public agency prepare or plan for the disposition of property under the Surplus Land Act?
Yeah, so this law is really affecting how public agencies think about real estate. Any misstep now comes with the risk that could derail their project. So to prevent that, we consider whether they want to dispose of the land through the surplus process or the exempt surplus process, and then we can go from there.
So you mentioned surplus and exempt surplus processes. Is there a preferred route that a jurisdiction takes?
Yeah, so exemptions definitely provide the agency the most control over the future use of the site. So how RSG adds value is we'll evaluate whether an exemption can realistically work on the property given the agency's goals for the site. If the property will qualify for an exemption, we will almost always recommend that just because of that local control you gain. However, if not, we'll help our clients navigate the surplus process in a way that provides them the most flexibility over the future project at the site.
So we've talked a lot so far about disposition of property. What about agencies or local jurisdictions that are looking to acquire land?
It definitely affects them as well. Agencies who would like to purchase land, whether that be for economic development purposes, housing, or really any other use, now have to consider the Surplus Land Act because it makes purchasing property a little bit more desirable than it used to be because once an agency owns it, there are so many restrictions tied to it and what can be done with it as its future use and future development. So we'll help advise on whether purchasing a property makes sense for the agency given their goals for the site, and then we'll make a plan based on that.
And are there any creative ways that you've seen agencies navigate around the Surplus Land Act to facilitate either a housing or economic development project?
Yeah, if an agency owns the property, there are very little ways around it. The Surplus Land Act is going to apply. However, if they don't yet own the site, there are some other options. Traditionally, site control has been the key for facilitating certain economic development and housing projects, as you had mentioned. But increasingly, we're seeing public agencies are working directly with developers in a little bit of a different capacity, without purchasing the property, which to help make the projects happen.
Well, that's really interesting and insightful. So, what happens if an agency isn't compliant with the law? And what does RSG do to ensure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, as with other laws, if you don't follow it, there are going to be penalties. So the California Department of Housing and Community Development, they're the enforcement agency for the Surplus Land Act. If a transaction is in violation of the SLA, HCD will issue a financial penalty. Because of that, RSG will work with the multiple parties that are involved in transactions. We'll work with buyers, legal counsel, third-party consultants, as well as HCD directly to ensure that the agencies are in compliance with the law and that compliance is also well documented.
You mentioned a little bit about how RSG assists in the process. Can you talk a little bit more about the value that RSG brings to a client when hired to advise on the Surplus Land Act?
Yeah, so RSG is able to bring a more holistic approach to each engagement that helps us facilitate both the transaction as well as the future project at the site. We've advised on over 30 surplus and exempt surplus transactions. We are a commercial brokerage, but beyond that, we are also housing and economic development experts as well. So we can help facilitate the surplus land transaction, but we can also underwrite the project later to help make the project happen.
And what SLA jobs do you find the most rewarding?
Yeah, essentially, I find any project that I'm able to help facilitate a project that serves the community rewarding. The Surplus Land Act, its intent is to help encourage affordable housing and open space purposes on public land, which is awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for sharing all of your knowledge on the Surplus Land Act. It sounds like a very complicated and complex issue. And thank you for tuning in today to join us in this discussion.